All right, good morning, everyone. So today we're going to be going over testing. Just really quickly, I want to talk about what we actually have here. So if you go into week 9, day 3, there's already a project in there that's been somewhat built for everyone. And if you want to follow along and go through the project with me, you're more than welcome to. So first things first, there's nothing special in public. When we look into our SRC, we see that we have a task.json, and all it has is a couple of different tasks, whether they're completed or not. And this is just a little task application. All right, so as we click on it, we see a couple of Bootstrap components. Here we have a row with links. If you click on the link, it goes to each individual task. If you go to completed task, it shows you only completed. If you go to pending, it shows you only pending. And then we have a home. All right. So here's our navbar using links. Our task preview, which is our Bootstrap component. Our app. Oh, hello, that's not the app. There you go. Our app, which contains our container. Instead of a div, we have our navbar. And then we have this task contextProvider, which we clarified over here. And all of that does is it just actually provides these tasks to be available for both pending and completed. Then we have our router. And in our router, we can see that we have a couple of routes. So first we have the empty path. We have our home at the index. We don't have any error boundary. When we move on to completed, we see the completed task page. We see the pending task page. And then if I click on individual task, we see the task page with the ID. Okay. Okay, so just so it's clear, we have pages, we have components, we have a data, and we have a couple of Bootstrap functionality. There's nothing special about this project, but today I wanted to go into testing, and we would actually go into testing on this project. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first part that we're going to go into is what is testing? Does anyone have any type of background about testing? What do you guys know about testing? Or is there anything you would like to see today that relates to testing?
From a nutshell, testing basically forces your takes your code and forces into some preset tests in order to make sure that it gets the proper output, and they can test everything from type or type, value, runtime, even if you're trying to do some kind of like time compiler. Yeah, that's base testing in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's awesome. So something super beneficial about testing is that, just like Jose mentioned, it always gives you the benefit of the doubt that your code is working. So it may not seem too, I guess, good at first glance, but when you're messing around with a project that's kind of big and you're merging different branches, you're running into merge conflicts, you're refactoring your code, you're changing from hash router to browser router, or there's things that you're changing in your project, and you want to ensure that your project still works properly without actually having to click through your entire project and ensuring that it all works. You could run your test suite, and if your test suite compiles correctly, then it gives you confidence that you refactored your code correctly, and every test is still passing, meaning that every component and every function within that component is still working. I've avoided it like a plague. Yes, so a lot of people try to avoid testing. I'm actually a very big fan of testing just because of the things that I've said. And then I've heard about using Jest for testing, but haven't gotten into it yet. It would be cool to see that in any capacity or even reference to that. That's awesome. So I'll take that point from here. And today what we're actually going to be using is Vitest. So V is a framework that we've been using lately to create all of our React project. But if we go into Vitest, we'll see that V knew that we were going to need a testing framework as well. And they wanted to be the end all be all. They wanted to provide everything that we needed for their framework straight to our hands. So they created this testing framework, which is Vitest. And under the hood, Vitest actually just runs Jest for the majority of its testing. There's a couple of extra capabilities the Vitest offers to us. And the main benefit to Vitest with Vite is that it doesn't need any extra type of configurations in order to be able to run Vitest on it. There's a couple of things here. We have the CLI stuff that we could run, and they actually have a very good documentation. They go into snapshots, how to make snapshots, and all that good stuff. And they even have this thing called mocking capabilities, which is going to be super useful for us, especially now that we're using something like Create Browser Router. So when you run testing, right, everything's running inside of your Vite compiler, but it's not actually compiling your code. It's not creating your project for you, because unit tests are supposed to be fast, they're supposed to be efficient, and they're supposed to provide results as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't be saving us any time at all. So since it doesn't create your actual project, there's a couple of things that there's a couple of issues that it runs into when we run our actual pages. So let's take a look at what our NavBar would look like if we tried testing it. So we're going to open up our SRC or source folder. There we'll create one called test. We'll name it unit. And this is just the naming complexity that's standard. And let me close some of this up. And so when I create my test, I like to bring up excuse me, I'm trying to sneeze. Apologize. I like to bring up the actual component that I'm going to test. And then after that, I like to create the file for it. And I name it exactly the same thing as the component. The only difference is that I'll put test JSX. And this way, Jest and Vitest will be able to recognize that there's a test suite. So now this is called a test suite inside of my actual project. So if I press Control-C, I'll get out of building my project. This will start throwing all kinds of errors. But now I want to actually install Vitest. So I'll just run npm install Vitest. We'll see it installing. And let's actually take a look at our package.json. Okay, so now we see Vitest and our dependencies. And we also want to install React TestRenderer. So we'll go npm install React TestRenderer. And now we see React TestRenderer as well. So now we have both of these, and we could actually put Vitest as one of our scripts. So we'll name it test. And it will use the Vitest package or command. Okay, awesome. So now if I run npm test inside of my project, we'll see it goes into Vitest, and it's going to give me this nice little failure message. When you guys remember running tests in Django, and Django, all it gave you was a bunch of dots, right? And then it would just tell you which dot failed and which one passed. Well, Vitest is a lot nicer, and it actually goes specifically and tells you what the error is and where the error is located. So now it tells me no test suite was found in this file. All right, awesome. So let's start building our test. So we're going to import a couple of things from Vitest. We're going to grab in describe. We're going to grab it, expect, and after that, we're going to tell it that we want to bring it in from Vitest. We also want to import the test renderer. From React test renderer. And we want to import our actual component. And just like I mentioned, actually, I'll go into that right after demonstrating it. So let's build our first test. So first we have our describe block. And in our describe block, typically we want to say what it is that we're actually testing. Am I testing a function? Am I testing the page? in this case, I'm gonna put example because this will be my very first test. And all I'm doing here is I'm ensuring that it returns true. I'm gonna build an if block inside of it. So again, the describe tells me what this test is testing. The if block is going to tell me what the test is actually doing, right? So which portion of my navbar am I actually testing? In this case, is an example. And here it checks if 5 is 5. And put a comma again. Open this up. And now we can say const num is equal to 5. And then on our next line, we could have an expect block and say we want to expect num to be 5. And it passes my test, right? Now, if I change this and I put it to 4, we see that we got a failure, and it tells me specifically where it failed. So it tells me object is not equality, and then it tells me that the number 4 expected it to be 5, and it said expected 5, received 4. So now I know that there was a problem here. Are you watching this, Django devs? No, I am not. Was that a question directed towards me? Am I getting? No, okay.
I wish the Django devs were watching how much nicer the testing is.
Yeah, so this is our describe block. This is how our describe block, again, doesn't actually run any test. And if you guys noticed, if I just have a describe block, my test suite still fails because there's no test inside of it. Once I build my if block, that's when Vitest is able to recognize that I'm running some sort of assertion. And inside of my if block, that's where you want your body to be located. So you want, typically you want to go setup, which will be the very top portion of your test. Then you want, so once you have setup, then you have your building assumption variables. And then the last stage would be running expectation. So in this case, this should be in here. And our setup portion will be better visualized once we actually go into the testing of the navbar. So let's start that. So we go on to describe. We specify what I am testing. And in this case, I'm testing my navbar component. So I'll say navbar.jsx. That way, anyone who looks at this test can now say, oh, okay, this is the test specific for the navbar. Question for whenever. I see the test running in real time. You could have this running live as well while you code other files once the tests are all set up. Yes, that is correct. So that will go into test-driven development, which I will demonstrate towards the end of the lesson. And that is where you'll create your test first before creating any type of functionality inside of your application. You can tell it what behavior it is that you want it to return. And as you develop, you can see this test continue failing until you build the function correctly, and then it will pass. And once it passes, you know you're good to move on to the next portion. All right. So now let's say my if block, and what it will actually test is I wanted to test the children inside my navbar component. So there's a couple of arguments about how exactly you should run your if block, but the thing that everybody does agree with is that the idea behind test-driven development. Yes, that is the idea behind test-driven development. You create the test, you watch your test fail, you create the logic to pass the test, and then once you pass the test, you can move on forward. Awesome. As I was saying, so there's a couple of different things that people have into what should go into the describe block, what should go into the test block. You typically have a testing team that will build those tests. But what everybody agrees with is that you just need to be as descriptive as possible so that if anybody hops into your project and they notice they're failing a test because they got tasked with, I don't know, refactoring the NavBar and styling it to make it look pretty, and they fail this test, they can actually see why they're failing it and what the test is actually testing for. So let's go into a little bit of setup. So now for setup, we know that we're going to have, let's just bring in the renderer, right? So I want to call it const navbar. And in this const, I want to use the test renderer. And what I want in this test renderer is I want to create a component and I want to create my navbar. All right, so if I go over to my navbar, I see my navbar doesn't take any type of props. It doesn't have any access to anything weird like use context. So technically that's all I should need to do. And after I do that, I have this really cool feature, which I could say to turn into JSON. I could console, oh, that ain't it. I could console log navbar so that we can see it. And so it's already giving me a problem. Right, it's giving me cannot be structured property base name of React namespace use context as it is known. Okay, so it's because I have use context inside of my router, and then we see here that it's not able to recognize link either. So luckily, React router was able to recognize that this was going to be a problem for people who develop and test-driven development. So they created this other type of router that we can all use. And it's called MemoryRouter. And it comes from React Router. And with MemoryRouter, what MemoryRouter does is it kind of just fakes the fact that you have different routes so that you are able to actually conduct your test correctly. And now that I put it inside of a memory router, it's able to give me all of the children in there, right? So we see that it renders the component and then it turns it into a JSON document. And there I could see that my navbar is a div, which is true. It is a div. I can see the styling that went into my navbar, and that's specified in props. And then I could go and see that I have an H1 where my H1 says something. So let's move in there. So let's go into Chilldren. Okay, perfect. So we see that an H1 that doesn't have any props, and it does have a Chilldren, which is my inner HTML, and that's of Taskmaster. All right, so here's our Taskmaster H1. I come over, I can see my H1, I see Taskmaster. Okay, great. I can also see that I have links. Now it's not recognizing them as link from browser, but it does recognize them as an anchor tag, which is essentially what they are under the hood. It can tell me the href at where they're pointing, and it can even tell me what they're named, right? So this is great. And let's say that I wanted to keep my navbar looking exactly the same the entire time, or maybe I could change some of the styling, but I want to ensure that my routes, that it is an anchor tag and that it is going to the correct route stays the same. So let's write some expectations for that. So let's say I want to expect, and here what we're going to do is we're going to, let's say, or home route. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to expect, here's our home. So I want to expect navbar dot children index 1, right? Because I can specify index 1 so I can see it. And there we see our home. And I want to go into types. And I want that to be an anchor tag. So it sees that it passes. Let's say that if I wanted this to be a division tag, what would it tell me? Okay, so same thing, tells me, hey, there's a problem in the assertion. and we expected to receive div, but we received an anchor tag. Okay. So that's good. We switch it back into anchor. And let's run it for our completed. And the only thing we really have to change here is that it should be a 2, then pending. And pending again should be a 3. Okay, so now so we could see it, we have anchor tags for the index 1 of this list. So at index 1, we have our home, and it checks that as an anchor tag. At index 2, we have completed, checks as an anchor tag. And then at index 3, we have pending, where it checks that it's an anchor tag. So that's fantastic. Now I know that all of them are anchor tags, but what if I want to know exactly where they're pointing? I want to know that they're pointing to the correct href. So let's take this test. Let's run it again. So it goes all the way down to types, but instead of types, I want to go into props. And then from props, I want to go into href. Okay, so here we got received a slash instead of an anchor tag. And we know that that is the correct link that it should be going to. So now this is all I need. Let's grab that. Let's create this. And let's put this at index 2 so that we can see it fail. Okay, so now it's failing. It's telling me it's in the wrong place. Change it back to completed. And here we could go to index 3 where we'll see it fail. And we could now change it back to pending. Okay, so now I could have the inner HTML change. They could label it something else, and they could even give it other types of props like styling if they wanted to. But for now, I at least know that it will still remain a link, and it will also remain the correct routes that I have corresponding to my React router. Okay, this is awesome. But let's say I also want to make a screenshot or a snapshot so that I can ensure the HTML.
Question before you go on.
Huh?
So before you added all those expect lines and you just had the test renderer create, it said it was passing the test. Is that just testing to see that something renders? Because you haven't told it what it should be looking for?
Yes. So if you don't have an expect block or an assertion inside of your a block, it's not actually running any test. It's just saying, oh, okay, well, the test suite has a test in there. So you pass the test.
Okay.
Once I run my expect blocks, that's when it actually starts running some logic and then gives me specific failures and so on.
Cool. Thanks.
No problem. And now here I have it will create a snapshot. And let's just take that right here. And I know typically we try to stick to the rule of we never code something twice, right? We could separate it so that we don't have to run into a problem, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to test, each test should be dependent on its own logic. So you shouldn't have to depend on some logic that ran on some other test to be able to run this one. So you will have a couple of repeated code in order to have your test completely dependent of each other and decoupled so that you could actually have a successful test suite as your project runs. So now I could say NavBar to match snapshot. I run this, it'll run, and then we see this little snapshot folder being created. Well, now if I look here, we have snapshot snap, and let me click on that. And now we see that it created quite literally a snapshot of the HTML belonging to NavBar JSX. right? Again, it's not recognizing that this is a link, but it is recognizing that it's an anchor tag. And it's recognizing that there's something that's supposed to happen on click. And it has the correct routing with the correct labels. So now, if somebody went into my navbar, and something really important to note, empty spaces don't do anything, right? When the HTML actually renders, there's nothing that happens with empty spaces. Everything remains the same, so my snapshot doesn't recognize empty spaces. But now let's say that I throw in a p tag here and I use lorem. Well, now my snapshot fails because it's going to tell me, hey, there's something going on inside of the snapshot. It received this lorem paragraph now, and that wasn't supposed to be there. Okay, so then I can, now as a developer, I know that somebody decided, oh, okay, well, that's done. There's not supposed to be any changes made to that. So I can just take that off and it comes right back to the way it was and still passes my snapshot test. And that is how you test your navbar.
Go back to that the snap file, which I want to see the.
This right here?
Okay, so that just literally hard coded everything into what it's supposed to look like.
Right.
You have currently in the navbar.jsx in the actual component, you have that set up as hard coding the styles. If you're pulling in classes and stuff, does it recognize that, or to just say it's classes?
Let's check it out. Let's see if it does. There you go. And let's say navbar. And let's grab all of that styling out of there. Okay, and now we go into the actual navbar component. Let's take that bad boy off. And let's go with class name. Navbar. Okay, so now it recognizes that there's a class name of navbar and that it didn't receive the style link. Does that answer your question, Dan?
Let's see here. So it's recognizing that it's expecting there to be hard coded styles from before, I think is why it's failing, right? Like the snapshot is not matching.
Correct. Yes. We added a class name instead.
Got it. Okay.
So then that brings me on to the next point with snapshots, right? Let's say that this was a change that I wanted because as a team, we all decided, hey, you know what? Maybe it's better to use class name instead of using inline style. So then I added a class name to the navbar, but now this is going to keep failing. Well, Vitest gives us this nice little tool where we could update our snapshot by pressing U on the keyboard. And then when we go back to our snapshot, we see that now the hard-coded styling is gone, and now we can see the class name of navbar. Awesome.
Can you undo pressing U? Because I can totally see myself accidentally pressing that.
Can I don't know about that. You might have to go through the Vitest API documentation and see if they have some sort of blocker for the U, which I'm sure they do somewhere. But it might take a little bit of extra configuration to get rid of the U. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So that takes care of our navbar. My navbar's tested. I took a screenshot. I confirmed that the elements in there are actually existing, or at least the elements that I want to test for, right? Which is the links. I don't really care if they change that H1 element, and I don't really care if they change the division to something else. So let's move on to our next component that I want to test. And let's say that the next component I want to test will be our completed, right? So let's go into pages and let's see our completed task. So completed is pretty simple, but it gets a little more complicated because now completed is utilizing use context. And because it's utilizing use context, it's going to actually create a couple of problems for me. So again, I'm not creating my actual project. So there's no existing DOM element when I'm running my test. And because there's no existing DOM, excuse me, when I'm running use context or running any type of context routing, Vitest is going to actually freak out and tell me, hey, I have no idea what to do with this information because I'm supposed to save this somewhere, but there's no place for me to save it, right? So let's create our test, and then we'll see how that situation develops and how we handle mocking with React Router and use context. So let's go into completed. And then tasks page.test.jsx. All right. And just like before, we want to import the scribe. We want to import it, and we want to import expect. And all of those are coming from Vitest. Okay, I want to import TestRenderer. It's coming from React TestRenderer. I want to also import my actual context, which was task context. There you go. And I want to import the component itself, which is completed task page. What else do I need to import? Let's import memory router from React Router DOM. Okay, so this is great. I have everything that I need. And then the last thing that I'm going to need to bring in is going to be my actual tasks. And this task is going to come from data. So I can go back into my data folder. Okay, and once I go back into my data folder, I can grab task.json. Awesome. So now that I have this, actually, before I move on, I'm going to clean up some of my syntax here. If you guys aren't using any type of syntax linter, I strongly recommend that you guys grab Prettier, and it's an extension here. So let me show you guys real quick for those of you who don't have it. This extension right here, it's going to really help with keeping your projects clean, especially as they get larger. It just follows regular JavaScript coding behaviors. All right, so let's go into my completed task. So again, I'm going to go into my describe block. And what I'm going to describe is that I am testing my entire completed task page. In my completed task page, I am moving on into an if block. And in this if block, I'm going to check the children. So checks children in completed. Okay, so let's get the at block and let's try to grab just our regular completed page and see what type of errors we get. So let's say const completed tasks page is equal to TestRenderer.create, and I'm just gonna grab my completed task page. And let's go to JSON. Okay, so it's already causing me problems. And when I look in here, it's telling me that the problem is use context. It's saying, hey, I have no idea where use context is supposed to be. So it says it cannot deconstruct property of task of use context as it is null. Okay, so this is great. Now, how do I fix that, right? We would think that we could just wrap it around MemoryRouter. And that by wrapping it around MemoryRouter, we would get the solution to this problem. But unfortunately, even with MemoryRouter, it still causes problems. So now with MemoryRouter, we still have that same exact problem. right? It has no idea what to do with use context. Now it's not null. Oh no, it is still null, but it's still having problems deconstructing it. And it gives me more errors here. So it happens, hey, it happened in completed task component, and it happened inside of the router at MemoryRouter. Okay, well, that means that my router wasn't able to pass the use context over to this completed task. So I'm going to have to actually pick up the slack for my router and create that behavior myself. So first, let's create the actual values I'm giving to my text router, right? So let's go back to files and let's take a look at app.jsx. So now in app.jsx, I see that I have task and set tasks. And that's what actually gets passed as a value into my task context provider. So I'm going to have to create those. When you're inside of your testing environment, you can't create a use state variable. So instead, you have to fake it or mock it, right? So we have tasks, and tasks are going to be equal to, I don't know. Let's make that, and let's actually link this, my task. So it's going to be initialized to my task. And then we have a function, which is set tasks. And that's going to take in a value. And that value will then get assigned to tasks. Right? This is essentially what our use state and set state does. So, okay, so now I'm mocking my use state function. And now I'm going to go into mocking my actual router or my actual text provider. So let's go into const and let's say mock context provider. And this context provider is going to take in children, right? Because technically, as we look here into our app, we see that it does have children. It has the outlet as a children of our text of our provider. So I'm going to have it grab children. And as it's grabbing children, now I'm going to grab the actual value. So let's say I want to create that on my own. The key of tasks will be assigned to tasks, and the key of set tasks will be assigned to set tasks. So now I created this little dictionary, and now in my return function, I can now grab my task context, pass the value to be equal to my, and let's just make this mock value, to my mocked value. And then again, it's going to take in children and then close the context. So this is awesome. The one thing that I did mess up here, though, is that this has to say provider on both sides. Okay, so now I'm back to my regular error where it's telling me, hey, still don't know what to do with this. Well, now let's actually give it the task context provider. So let's give it mock context. And now we see that it passed. So this is great. This was actually able to compile. I should actually be able to see my code. So let's see what it does. Let's say console.log, and let's grab the completed task page. Okay, so let's go to home completed. So now we see there's a division. All right, inside of my children, I have an H1, which will be the completed. And let's take a look at children a little better. Okay, so now if I go inside of children, we see that I have my H1 of completed, and then I also have this div, right? And notice I'm using Bootstrap, and it's able to recognize that it has the class name of row. It even has some style length. So let's go into, well, the first one's pretty direct forward, but let's say I want to look into one of these divisions, right? So let's say I want to go into index 1. Let's see what that gives us. So in index 1 tells me I have a div, tells me I have props. I have some inline style inside of this row, class name of row. And then I have children inside of that division. So let's go further in. Let's check what the children are. Now in the children, I have, again, a type div. I have two type divs, but they each have a class name of column of 3, which is this little ID portion. And then I have a class name of column of 6. And then I could even go even further in there and check out what index 0 looks like. And it even tells me, hey, this has a type of A. There's some children in there, which is just the inner HTML, which would be the number 2. And there's some props still attached to it. So let's go back into children in there and see what it looks like even deeper. And here we see the display flex and the justify content and all that good little style and stuff. So now we go into children again, and now we finally see, okay, well, there's an anchor tag. All right. And its href is going to task/2 for that individual task. And then it tells me the child. Excuse me. And then it tells me the child, which is just the inner HTML of the number of 2. So let's change this to 2. And I wonder what that will look like. No, they're not 21. We don't have that many. So in 2, we see that there's a 3, which is coming here. And then if I go into the third one, we see that it goes as deep as possible to figure out that the number 4 is in there. So this is great. This is showing me what I want it to show me. But I generally just want this division block to be tested, right? Just one of them, because I want to ensure that when it does have children, that there's something in there. So let's check that. Also, notice that this isn't grabbing what's actually on the application, right? This is the values that we're seeing here is coming from our data. So as long as this task JSON data stays the same for testing purposes, so nobody messes with it, this test will pass regardless of what type of test we set up for it. But let's check. So the first one, let's move on. And here we could see a little bit of the setup process more clearly. So we have setup. Then we have build our test, right? Because this is actually building our test, what it is that we want to see. And then finally, we have our running tests where we run our expectations. So let's say I want to expect completed task, children, and let's say I just want the length of that. And we see that we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So H1 and then 3 divisions. So I could say to be 4. Okay, so that test passes. Let's see if I make it into 3. What will it give me? It gives me a failure saying it received 4 and it should be 3. Okay, so perfect. So now I have 4. Let's say I want to expect that completed task dot children index 0. Let's just see what index 0 looks like. Oh, I guess we want index 1.
You have a P on the end of children in line 33.
Ooh, nice. Thank you. And here we see div, we have our props, et cetera, et cetera. So here we know that it's supposed to be a class name of row. And that's probably something that I want to make sure that it maintains. So let's go into props. And let's grab class name. And let's say that I expect that to be a row. Okay, so it's passing. Let's say that I expected it to be another class. Well, now it's going to fail because I'm getting another class instead of row. Okay, so this is perfect. Now I check that it's a row. What else would I want to check here? I would probably want to check that it also holds 2 children, right? So let's run that as our last expectation. And let's expect completed task dot children index 1. And dot children dot length. And let's expect that to be 2. Okay, so now if I put there was supposed to be 3 children inside of that row, it would tell me, hey, no, there's not, there's only 2. So now I can check 2. So now I know this is constructing properly. I know that there's 4 elements inside of my HTML. I know that they are rows, and I know that they have 2 children, one being the ID and one being the book. I could go on testing every single thing, ensuring that the book and the ID and all the links are in there. But in this case, we would want some flexibility in case of our app growing, or unless we decided as a team this is exactly how we want it to stay, we could always use Snapshot, and Snapshot will take care of the more in detail testing. So let's do the snapshot now. It will create a snapshot of the completed task.jsx. Let's take off this console.log so that we don't see it anymore. And let's actually just grab all of this so that we don't have to manually retype it. Okay, so we bring it in. And then lastly, we want to expect completed task page to match the snapshot. Okay, and now when I look at snapshot, we see that it automatically created a completed task. So when I look at completed task, now we see we have our division, we have our H1 component, then we have our class name of row with the inline styling that I gave it. Inside of that row, I have a column of 3 with the inline styling that I gave it, an anchor tag, where that anchor tag is following to, the inner HTML of that anchor tag. Then it has the column of 6, and it shows that it's on display flags, justify center. Again, the anchor tag pointing to that same exact ID. But now instead of the inner HTML being the ID, the inner HTML is actually the task title. This is great. So now everything's working properly. I have all of that constructed. And I just tested my home completed. I haven't tested my pending task, and I have home. So if I were to test my pending tasks, can anybody tell me how I could go into testing it, or does anyone have an idea of what the steps would be?
Before we move on,
Yeah, of course.
I kind of lost track when you were doing the use context, like how you patched that in. Could you just run through that really quick again?
Yes, of course. So if we look into my completed task, it wasn't able to recognize my use context. So what I actually had to do was add a mock, a context provider. So I created a function that took in children, meaning kind of like we see in HTML, right? So when I go to my app.jsx, we have our context provider, and it has a child, and that child being the outlet. So now when I'm mocking here, I give it the children, then I make my mocked value, which is a dictionary of keys and values. So the key being task with the value of the actual element tasks here. Then I have set tasks with the value of the actual function of setting tasks. And I kind of just mocked a use state, right? So that's supposed to be the equivalent of saying const tasks set tasks. And then say that's equal to use state. And let's say that's just an array of dictionaries. I mean, an array of objects, right? So this is what I'm mocking here. So now when I go to mock my task provider, I still call my task context provider, and then I give it these values, the ones that I mocked up here. And then after that, I just give it the argument of children, because it's supposed to take in the children, and that's what's supposed to get passed in line 51, right? So now when I went into my test renderer, I have my regular memory router, which allows me to not exactly build my project, but it will build the router functionalities that I may need for testing. Then I go into my mock context provider. So now I didn't pass any values into it because I already passed it in here. And then after that, I run in line 59, the completed tasks. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks.
And then isn't there a way to just import the task context into the text file directly and then wrap the completed task page element in the task context provider rather than a mock context provider, and then run the text normally? Can you explain how to get a snapshot again? Yes. So I'm going to answer Dinosaur or Dan right after. I feel goofy saying dinosaur. And then so I'll go into Dale first. So Dale, for creating a snapshot, all it does is in your assertion, you just have to call this function. Whenever you do your expect block, as long as you call the toMatch snapshot function, as soon as this test suite runs and it recognizes that you want to build a snapshot, if there's not a snapshot that already exists, it will create it for you. Does that answer your question? Okay, awesome. All right, so for Dan, so you're saying, is there a way that I could just use this instead of having to do this wild stuff? So let's try it out. Let's see if it will comply. Let's say I want to use my task context dot provider, and that I want my value to be tasks and set tasks. Okay, so maybe this needs an extra. Okay. So it's saying it passed, and we have a bunch of assertions here. So it must have passed. Oh, this is the wrong place. But let's take a look at the snapshot. Let's see. Well, if it was able to recognize all of that, then it must have been able to recognize the snapshot. So let's try it here. I'm doing this on my project, so quickly ran into this and made a Google search. I already had the state in a custom provider in a separate context JSX. I had to use MemoryRouter in the test file and to change my create context to create context in place of null. Not sure if it worked because I already created the provider.
Sorry, I meant the long thing to be just to throw it out there.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah. The Google search just said that it gets upset about the null, because in create context at the very top, we put it parentheses null, and it told me just to change that to an empty string, which does not to me mean anything. But then just using the same user context, importing it in. Like I said, I have no idea if it's because I already had that provider separated out there, but wrapping the component in the memory router, let it figure itself out. So
Yeah,
it's semantic.
You mean like it's like you mean like it is now, right? Like with the way he has it now with the memory router, and then inside that you have the task context. Or are you talking about mock context?
So much simpler. Like I said, in my provider, I already established the use state. So I think mine's using that to still have it.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't do anything besides in the create TestRenderer.create memory router, my own app nav, MemoryRouter. And as long as the create context originally came with an empty string, it did not, it passed all the tests.
Okay.
But that might be because I already had made that provider separately.
Yeah, I
It
may
would
have
actually be very interesting to see if it works without that.
yeah, I may have to look into that further on.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, it's
Yeah.
two ways to make it work, which I don't like splitting hairs on.
Yeah, definitely. So if you guys look this stuff up, there's gonna be thousands of ways to make it work. But the point is to get it working and to actually be able to test your components in there. That way you know what's actually inside of each page and what's being tested, right? And then the real importance of what you guys will get out of this is that when you guys receive assessment 4, you guys will actually receive a test suite, and your score will be dependent on how many tests will pass, right? So that's the importance of you guys understanding what's going on in the test and how to build test. So I'm just trying to make this as, I guess, as most in-depth as possible. That's a way of mocking a task context, but as you guys can see here, we don't need it, right? Awesome. Okay, so now we have our app, we did our pending. Oh no, we actually did our completed. And if we were to do our pending task actually looks like an exact same replica as completed. The only difference is the H1 element and some of the components in there, right? But other than that, there's really no change. So I could test the pending tasks altogether. So let's see what pending looks like. Yeah, so we see here, it's exactly the same thing. The only difference is it's mapping through all the tasks that are not completed rather than mapping through the tasks that are completed. All right. So if we were to build a test for it, it would look almost exactly the same. So let's run a new file and let's do pending tasks page dot test dot JSX. Okay, so there's our pending task page. As we said, it's almost going to be exactly the same. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab all this, bring it over to my pending task, and I name that text instead of test. Boom. There we go. Okay, so now I could place this in there. But instead of grabbing my completed task, I actually want my pending task. So let's import pending. Tasks page from pages / pending task page. All right. Let's grab pending task page, same thing here. Okay, so I was able to go in there. And it seems like it already created a snapshot, and that's because of what I had before. So I just have to update my snapshot real quick. So I press U, and it updated my snapshot. But as far as everything else, right, it still recognizes that there's 4 elements, because in pending, I have H1, I have my 4 elements, still recognizes that there's a row, and it still recognizes that there's 2 children inside of each row. It was able to pass all of the tasks and the inside of the task provider. And then it was able to actually create our snapshot, which if we take a look at pending task page, now our pending task page has pending, has our regular snapshots, but we see that there's different functions in there, right? So we have task number 1 in completed, we have task number 2. And now we have a task built out for completed task and pending task. But there's a little more cleanup that I want to do here. I want to make sure that this is saying pending. So let me go here. Right, and then that's one of the dangers of, I guess, copying and pasting. It's just you run the chance of having a lot of variables that are not named correctly, and then you'll have to go in there and manually change. Okay, so everything changes, all the changes were made correctly, and we see here that this was obsolete because there was no changes to the snapshot, so it never bothered to even change anything in there. And it just omitted the test because it knows there was no change to the actual snapshot that it needs to check for. Awesome. So now we've tested our NavBar, we've tested the completed task, we've testing pending, and well, it's already 8:03. It's already 10:03. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back, test home, and then we'll go into actually testing functionality afterwards. So let me stop the recording here.